Judith Levi was born and raised in New York City, but she has lived in Chicago for over 50 years. She was a linguistics professor at Northwestern University for 29 years, from 1972 through 2001. During that time, she also served as a freelance consultant to lawyers on cases involving disputed language. Since leaving academia in 2001, she has dedicated herself to working in German-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation. In 2015, the President of Germany awarded her the Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany for her exceptional achievements in promoting reconciliation between the German and Jewish peoples. Over the last decade, she has given over 50 public presentations in the U.S. and Germany, as well as a dozen talks to German high school students about her surprisingly positive experiences in German-Jewish reconciliation. Drawing on those experiences, she also lectures on these three broader themes that are of relevance to all of us: identity, reconciliation, and forgiveness, and how they are interrelated. Today, she will be speaking to us on the identity paradox, how our multiple identities both divide and unite us. Please welcome Judith Levi.
Thank you, Marilee. I think everybody can hear. It's a great mic system. Okay. So as Marilee mentioned, I have been engaged in German-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation work for the last 20 years. In the course of my explorations, I discovered many new things about my own identity and about how identity plays an essential role in intergroup conflict, sometimes in fostering and prolonging it, sometimes in resolving it. I also learned that who or what we identify with has a great effect on whether we are resistant to reconciliation or ready for it. So today I would like to share with you some insights about the fundamental nature of identity and about what I call the identity paradox, how our multiple identities can be both functional and dysfunctional at the same time. That is, we can use our identities to build walls or to build bridges. The choice is ours. Not only is this understanding important for our own lives, but it is essential for understanding the innumerable intergroup conflicts all around the world that arise from and are then aggravated by identity issues. I was reminded of this a few weeks ago when I heard a British woman being interviewed about Brexit. She proclaimed, "We're not Europeans, we're British, and that's it." In the current Israeli political campaign underway, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing supporters are using the slogan "Bibi or TB" to exploit identity politics. Since TB refers to a long-standing Israeli Arab member of parliament, Israeli parliament, Netanyahu is framing the voters' choice as one between us Jews and those Arabs and the Jews who would work with them. And of course, we are all still reeling from the mass murder perpetrated just 10 days ago by a white Australian man convinced that his people were so much worthier of life on earth than Muslims, any Muslims, that he felt his identity entitled him to murder them for their identity. So identity is not just a fascinating subject. It is one which can determine who lives and who dies. Now, having lived in the Chicago area for over 50 years now, I have many winter scarves that help to shield me from the challenges of Chicago winters. And among all those scarves, one of my favorites is this one. It's the longest and most colorful one in my collection. And as you can see, it's woven from strands of more than 20 different colors. Moreover, every single strand of yarn is itself multicolored. Oranges merging into reds, greens merging out of grays and into purples, and blues of every hue. And that's just how it is with the interwoven strands that form our identities. If you were to wonder about me, well, what is she, really? There could be no single right answer. Like everyone else's, my identity is far from monochromatic. In my case, one color, so to speak, of my identity scarf is being female. One color is being Jewish. One color is being the child of European immigrants, and one color is being American-born and raised. Another color comes from having grown up in New York City. Another one is from my career as a linguistics professor. And one color is, without a doubt, my so-called white skin color. If people lump me with the Jews or with those women or with white folks, because I have those colors in my identity scarf, they're ignoring all the other colors there, at least at that moment. So using any single identity category to label me is like identifying my body with just my left elbow or my curly hair. Our identity is a complex, multifaceted whole, not something that can be accurately described by any single noun or adjective. Like Joseph in the Hebrew Bible, we all wear coats of many colors. As a thought experiment, imagine for a moment what it would be like to live in a world in which we walked around in cloaks of many colors that fully concealed our bodies, like the all-enveloping burqas that Muslim women wear in certain cultures. And thus, whenever we met someone else, we couldn't recognize the unique person hidden beneath the cloak. But the diverse colors woven into the fabric of our cloaks would signal what groups we belong to. So by seeing which strands of color, if any, in the other person's cloak matched some of our strands, we could figure out what we had in common with them. So if I saw the color that meant female, I would know we had that in common. If I saw the color that meant New Yorker, I would know we had that in common, and so forth. That would certainly be a comfort in such a world, for we love to find commonalities with others, to feel that we both belong to the same group, to the same circles. And we also often feel relief in finding such commonalities in someone whom we had, until that moment, regarded as a stranger. But although I am a New Yorker, I am different, in part, from the Irish American Catholics with whom I shared my childhood neighborhood in Manhattan, and from the Pakistani or Nigerian immigrants whom I might encounter on the New York subway today. Although I am a woman, I am different, in part, from a dear friend of mine named Khadija, both because she was born into a Muslim Berber family in Casablanca, Morocco, and because she now works as a homeopathic doctor in France. And if someone recognizes from my family name, Levi, that I'm Jewish, they wouldn't necessarily know how different I am, in part, from an Iraqi Jew, or Texas Jew, or Brazilian Jew, or any Orthodox Jew, for that matter. Each strand of anyone's identity is only one strand in a wondrously unique garment. And so while each strand reveals one truth, it is mute about many others. Another discovery I've made that comforts me, actually, is that while our multiple identities can be used to divide us from each other, it's really important to recognize that each one forms a circle of connection for us. Some of my circles of connection are smaller in size, like the circle of other people named Judith, or the circles formed by Antioch College alumni. Others are far larger. The circle of Jews connects me to some 14 million people. the circle of Americans to over 325 million people, and the circle of girls and women to over 3.5 billion. And that's just counting those alive today. So I belong to each of these circles of connection and many more. Now, before we move on to the identity paradox, let's take some time to ask the very basic question, what is identity and where does it come from? My approach to this question has always been a personal one, based on what I have observed to be true in my own life and the lives around me, and what I have discovered in the course of my 15 visits to Germany over the last 20 years. And I will concentrate here on group identity rather than individual identity, because group identity has been so central to all my work on German-Jewish reconciliation. So I'm using the word identity to refer to our sense of who we are, and the term group identity to our sense of all the different groups we feel that we belong to. And where do all these group identities come from? Well, although we do often speak of our identity as who we are, it turns out that the elements that make up our group identities are determined not just by who we are, but also by what we do, what we believe, what we prefer, what we know, what we value, and even what we eat and what we wear. The construction of my identity as who I am began when I was born. As I took my first breath, I was already identifiable as a female, the second child of European immigrants, a Jew, a New Yorker, and a citizen of the United States. But over time, my identity has broadened out as I have entered into more changeable categories, such as those determined by what I do. What I do professionally, I was a linguistics professor, and now I'm an editor and author. What I do for fun, I'm a sometime folk dancer, and I juggle, sometimes. And what I do in other contexts, such as volunteer work. What I believe and what I value also contribute to my identity, especially because they are major determinants of both my spiritual and my political attitudes and affiliations, all of which can shift over the years. What I know, such as several foreign languages, has also influenced my identity in major ways, both professionally and personally. Even what we eat and don't eat, or refuse to eat, puts us into identity categories, such as vegan or vegetarian, kosher keeping, lactose intolerant, or omnivore. Some of you probably identify as meat and potatoes people. But the significance of that in our daily lives will depend on how much importance we attach to that aspect of our complex identity. So it's really amazing how complex and changeable over time our group identities are. And we also have to acknowledge that how important each identity is in our lives is determined not only by us, but often also by others. For example, many German Jews in the 1920s identified much more as Germans than as Jews. There was a time of great assimilation. But that all started changing once the Nazis took power and redefined who was who. In fact, my German Jewish stepmother, and who belonged, my German Jewish stepmother once said to me with great bitterness, "I wasn't a Jew until Hitler made me one." And a Danish-born librarian at Northwestern once told me, "I didn't know I was a Jew until they hid me in the cellar." It's precisely because our group identities are so multifaceted and so dynamic that the use of a single noun like she's a Jew or he's a Sicilian or they're Texans that purports to state the identity, the identity of an individual can be so inaccurate and thus misleading. I clearly remember my own experience as a college student studying in France for a year. Once people knew that my nationality was American, they felt free to make all kinds of assumptions often erroneous and often negative, about my cultural, political, and social attitudes. My inner reaction was one of indignation at being treated as if my whole identity could be predicted just from the American label. But truth to tell, we all use these oversimplified labels as linguistic and cognitive shortcuts for describing other people and then characterizing them and or judging them. Moreover, even when we are the ones applying an identity label to ourselves, any single label necessarily obscures great chunks of who we actually are. For example, a teenage friend of mine, born and raised in the United States, once explained to me that she was 1/4 Polish, 1/4 Italian, and 1/2 Irish. She figured that covered the whole territory. It took me a while to realize that she totally left out the American part of her identity, which was, in practice, is much more significant than all those things that she inherited. Now, as a linguist, I can't help but notice that one problem here is that these one-word names or nouns are actually abbreviations for entire sentences, which in turn could introduce whole stories. So when my young friend said she was 1/2 Irish, that label was shorthand in her case for this fact. Her father's parents were actually both born in the United States, but they are of Irish descent further back. And clearly they identified with that, or that wouldn't be part of her self-image. Or when I call myself a New Yorker, which I still do, the story behind the label runs like this. Born and raised in Manhattan, I retain a discernible New York accent, especially when I say 44 marbles, right? It's a giveaway. So I retain this accent as well as certain New York behavioral patterns, even though I haven't lived there for over 50 years. But the story behind my New Yorker label is almost the opposite of the one belonging to my father. He lived in New York for 65 years, far longer than I ever did, but he came there as a 23-year-old immigrant from Germany, and yet we both identified as New Yorkers. Another problem in using a single noun to denote specific identity categories has to do with changes over time, because the noun stays the same while the people it identifies keep changing due to the natural succession of new generations. For example, when the Catholic Church justified the official slandering and perennial persecution of the Jewish population throughout Europe for centuries, because it was the Jews whom the church held responsible for killing Jesus, it was deliberately ignoring the fact that the Jews it was thus accusing had been dead for many centuries. Similarly, when someone tells me today that they still refuse to have anything to do with the Germans because of what the Germans did during the Holocaust, using that phrase, the Germans, obscures the fact that, due to the passage of time, almost all the people we call the Germans of today are simply not the same individuals who were the Germans in the Nazi era. Unfortunately, we humans are not always willing to make the effort to make these fine linguistic distinctions, especially when doing so might oblige us to take a fresh look at our prejudices. Time plays another important role in the expression of our identity. This is because at different times we can choose to foreground or background any given element of our identity to suit our own purposes in a particular context. When I used to give talks at linguistic conferences, the most important element of my identity that I wanted to project was my professional identity as a competent, creative language analyst. In that situation, my identity as a Jew or as a woman or as a New Yorker was perfectly irrelevant. But in other contexts, say among Jewish friends or family, I have the option to emphasize our shared Jewish identity. To accomplish that, I can include more references to Jewish culture and traditions, and I can modify my speech to include more Yiddish-influenced intonation patterns or some of the Yiddish or Hebrew expressions or vocabulary that also serve as linguistic markers of my Jewish identity. Similarly, I can try to make somebody feel excluded if I was so mean by using that when that was not part of their identity. We can use language to do all kinds of things. We can be inclusive or exclusive. It's fascinating to see how easily people from all different backgrounds make these kinds of conversational and situational adaptations, finding ways to emphasize the commonalities they share with the people they are speaking with. For example, I just found out that Marilee is a birder, and I said, oh, do you know Libby Hill, who's a big birder? So they share that identity, and I wanted to bring them together. It just felt natural. I'm sure you can recall how even with perfect strangers, such as someone you've met at a party or convention, you manage to find a way to emphasize some strand of your identity that you shared with them. Oh, you live in Rochester? I worked there one summer long ago. Or, oh, your son's in marching band? My daughter is too. We do that all the time. And this ability of ours to sometimes highlight and sometimes suppress a particular identity strand, depending on the context, is one more reason to recognize that no single noun or name or label will ever be able to adequately describe our full identity. So now that we have a better idea of how rich and varied our identities can be, it's time for me to explain what I call the identity paradox. The indisputable fact that our intense connections to our identities can be both functional and dysfunctional, both beneficial and harmful, both divisive and unifying. And this is true in our personal lives as well as in society at large. To understand that, let's return now to the idea that each group with which we identify, whether small or large, inherited or freely chosen, can be seen as forming a circle of connection. And since we all have multifaceted identities, we necessarily belong to numerous circles of connection. Some of those circles are smaller in size, with a more limited membership, starting with our nuclear family, while others are larger, with a much more inclusive membership. Our most limited identities are the most intimate and sometimes the most enduring. But they can be troublesome too in their own way. So here are 4 really important things to keep in mind about these limited identities. First, the limited identities that create all those circles of connection are very attractive because they satisfy our innate human longing to connect and to belong. Second, these limited identities are very powerful because they can give us many things we value. If we're lucky to have an identity that our society more or less privileges, these membership rewards, so to speak, provide us with a sense of community, rootedness, and strong self-esteem, as well as access to assets such as land, education, power, or wealth. If we're unlucky in having an identity that is devalued by our society, we might be denied such valuable assets and saddled with impaired self-esteem to boot. Whichever way it turns out, our limited identities matter greatly to our status in life, given how many societies, maybe all of them, allocate their privileges according to a person's race or gender, religion or national origin, caste or tribe. Third, these limited identities can be very misleading because they often obscure or devalue or even deny the much more inclusive identities that connect us in deeply meaningful ways to the larger communities to which we also belong. For example, when the Nazis decided that the Jews were outsiders and subhuman, they were denying all the things that German Jews had in common with all the other Germans, language and culture and education and geography and so forth. So they took just one piece out of that identity and then made it into a murderous program. So, fourth, these limited identities, as in the case I just mentioned, can become very dangerous because when we use them to draw a circle that defines us, we simultaneously create a wall that keeps them on the outside. And dividing people in our world into us and them has been and continues to be the source of much misery and suffering on this earth. The very future of humanity in regions large and small may depend on the extent to which we can learn to strengthen our identification as a part of our greatest, most inclusive community, humanity, while still rejoicing in our membership in our respective smaller communities. In this way, we can have not just the best of both worlds, but the best of all of our circles of connection. Now I want to speak about how identity can be an obstacle to reconciliation, whether between individuals, ethnic or racial groups, or even nations. In my own journey to German-Jewish reconciliation, I learned a lot about this identity paradox, how our identities, for example, as Jews or Germans, can keep us apart, as well as how we can choose to reframe our understanding of identity in order to build bridges instead of walls between people with different identities. So I want to take some time to explore how one particular type of identity, victim identity, can block our openness to reconciling with a group that we view as the perpetrator group. I had to learn all about this on my own journey to German-Jewish reconciliation because as a post-Holocaust Jew, I definitely saw myself and other Jews as belonging to the category of victim vis-a-vis the perpetrators. And you can think about how many conflicts in the world today are aggravated by people claiming to be super victim. I'm more of a victim than you are. And so victim identity can be a very strong force in dividing people. So one major obstacle to reconciliation that is based on victim identity is the fact that members of a victimized group typically feel a powerful solidarity with one another. A solidarity strengthened by their shared victim identity, their shared persecution history, their shared hatred for their oppressors, and their shared sense of injustice. As a result, if any members of the victimized group, or the group that claims to be victimized, contemplates reconciling with the perpetrator's group, they may hesitate out of the conviction that they would be betraying that solidarity in doing so. Alternatively, they may fear that they would be accused of betraying their own group in seeking any rapprochement at all with one of them. And so they may hold back so as not to jeopardize that valued solidarity, that valued connection. This kind of solidarity can be seen in the fact that many Jews to this day cannot conceive of how any other Jew could freely choose to live in Germany, the so-called land of the murderers. Such a choice is viewed by these people as a violation of solidarity with other Jews, and especially with the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. An African-American graduate student of mine once gave me another example of how solidarity within a victimized group can block reconciliation. When he heard me speak about the aversion of some Jews to the very idea of reconciling with Germans, it reminded him of those African Americans who keep themselves apart from so-called white society and who try to avoid acting white out of solidarity with their victimized group. Another way of looking at how our identities can be an obstacle to reconciliation is to recognize that giving up one's old identity, whether it's a victim identity or some other kind, can be difficult for anyone, regardless of the context. We see this kind of struggle in friends who have just become empty nesters. Oops, I'm not taking care of my kids every day anymore. Who am I? Or people who have just become divorced or widowed, or starting retirement. Or maybe we ourselves have faced such a challenge. Such identity changes can be difficult because the old identity provides the comfort and the sense of safety of a familiar perspective, familiar associations, and familiar experiences. As a result, it's natural to want to avoid, where possible, the kind of birth pains that any significant change in one's identity would entail. But Getting stuck in an outmoded or overly limiting identity is like locking oneself into an identity cage, a move which may exact a high price in personal freedom and potential for growth. One day, back in 2002, I was reflecting on the inner costs of repeatedly returning to the memory of past sufferings. This was a pattern I myself had found extremely hard to escape in regard to the trauma I suffered when my mother died at age 42 of cancer and I was just 8. And it was a trauma later aggravated by my stepmother's grave inadequacies as a parent. As a result of these childhood experiences, a central part of my identity became that of motherless child. One variation on the theme of victim identity, which guided my thinking and behavior for many years. But after meditating on this theme for a while, on that day way back in 2002, I wrote this in my journal. The victim identity that so many victims naturally assume but imprudently hold on to at all costs is a strong barrier to reconciliation because it keeps them focused over and over again on the harm done to them by the other. It's like a freeze frame in their personal history or their group identity, which never gets resolved or transformed. Psychologically, it's never considered healthy or beneficial to remain forever in the role of the widow or the abused or the orphan, because that just locks one into a life of sorrow or bitterness or perpetual fear of abandonment or whatever, and because it's so limiting. We can all have such a breadth of identities and can contribute to our world locally and more globally in so many ways that staying locked into these identity cages is tragic, both for the individual and for the broader society. The trick seems to be in understanding that having had a victim experience does not require us to remain imprisoned in a victim identity forever after. Let me say that again. The trick seems to be in understanding that having had a victim experience does not require us to remain imprisoned in a victim identity forever after. The toughest obstacle here may be the fact that forging a new identity requires one to move emotionally and perhaps literally into unfamiliar and as yet unknown territory. And this can be intimidating or even terrifying. Believe me, I had very mixed feelings the first time I went to Germany in 1998. So one way to ease such a transition to moving toward the other is to look to inspiring role models. However, these are all too often lacking in the sphere of reconciliation, or they're overshadowed by their opposites. If, God forbid, we let the news media determine our picture of the world, we are soon inundated by stories of revenge, retaliation, and other means of perpetuating past injustices and historical hatred, many of which are driven by the exploitation of identity differences. For every example of reconciliation that we hear about, we probably hear 100 examples of the opposite. So this makes it all the more essential that we discover how we can reframe our perspectives on our identities and those of the other or the others in such a way as to foster a more harmonious society rather than a fractured and polarized one. Victim identity is just one of the many, many identities that lead us to see the world in terms of the distinctions between us and them, and to believe not only that it's in our interest to maintain those distinctions, but that they may be essential to life itself. We do this even though in another part of our awareness we may well recognize how much misery has been created over the ages by just such divisions. And of course, we're not always in the us category, we're often in the them category in the eyes of somebody else. So we're familiar with that kind of discomfort to say the least. The uncomfortable truth, however, is that we cannot do otherwise. We have to see, we cannot not divide people into us and them. Endless lessons from history, as well as a wide range of recent scientific research, ranging from social psychology to evolutionary biology, have demonstrated how ingrained and inescapable is this instinct of ours to distinguish us from them. This is surely related to the fact that we share this instinct with many other social animals, from bee swarms to wolf packs to elephant families. Think about it. All these animals are very sensitive to who is in their in-group and who is an outsider. So we're not alone in this instinctive behavioral pattern. What to do? Is there a way out? Is there a remedy? Can we leave a better legacy to our children and grandchildren? All my experiences, not only as a Jew in Germany, but in many other settings, have taught me that the answer is yes. And just as identity is central in creating and aggravating so many conflicts around the world, so will identity be central to finding an enduring resolution. So I call this concluding section the challenge and promise of identifying with our common humanity. Fortunately, the fact that we cannot escape dividing ourselves into innumerable us and them categories does not mean that this is all we can do. We are not helpless, because the very attractiveness of belonging to a group can be turned to our advantage and the advantage of all humanity by recognizing all the groups to which we belong. A game I once played with some young children illustrates this idea. It was summer, and I was attending a large picnic together with many friends and their children. At one point, I found myself entertaining a group of girls that I already knew. They were all under the age of 7. So I wanted to amuse them. So I invented a game that we might call, How Much Do We Share? So I asked them a series of questions designed to reveal the many different ways in which they had things in common. But given their ages, these questions weren't about nationality or religion or political allegiances. Instead, I asked, who's wearing something yellow? Who likes to sing? Who lives in Chicago? Who has a daddy who's a musician? Because I knew 2 of them did. Who's an only child? Their answers created an intriguing dynamic. I could actually ask everybody here to raise their hands at these. Who's wearing yellow? So you have that in common. Who's an only child? Not many. Okay, it's a very exclusive group. We could do this, but I'll go on. So their answers created an intriguing dynamic as each question divided this group of friends in a new way. But it also tied them together with a whole network of newly discovered commonalities. And from their delighted smiles at each round of this impromptu game, I could tell how much they appreciated this fun way of discovering how many ways they were alike. Perhaps this anecdote can serve as a parable for the ways in which we all can develop a greater flexibility in what and whom we identify with, so that we don't have to choose one set of circles, one set of identities over another. Instead, we can continue to enjoy the indisputable benefits of belonging to our smaller circles of connection, while enriching our sense of belongingness by remembering, honoring, and even savoring the larger circles of connection to which we also belong. And the largest of those circles of connection is the human family. For the secular and the humanist, especially the ethical humanist, we are all in the same family, traditionally referred to as the family of man. And for those who believe in God, we are all the children of God, which certainly makes us one family. One of the most powerful expressions of this all-inclusive perspective is one I heard 20 years ago in Germany, during a sermon given by a Catholic priest in my father's hometown of Mayen. The sermon was part of an ecumenical memorial service on the 60th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and that's what had brought me to Germany for the first time. The somber theme of the sermon had been the responsibility of the Catholic Church in contributing to the horrors of the Holocaust. But near the end, the priest segued into this very striking parable. In a Jewish legend, a rabbi asks his students, "When does the transition from night to day take place?" When his students' replies didn't satisfy him, he gave this answer to his own question. When you look into the face of your fellow human being, and you discover in it the face of your brother or your sister, then night has come to an end, and day has dawned. The fact is, we are not powerless. We have the power of human choice to create the life we choose to live and to craft the moral legacy we choose to leave to the next generations. We can perpetuate the darkness created by human divisions, or we can do whatever is in our power to bring the light that values human solidarity into the world in which we live. Each person must decide whether to make this commitment, and if so, in what ways. One place to start would be by making an effort to look for similarities each time we get tense or anxious about differences. And we can remember to identify with our common humanity whenever we find ourselves judging another group whom we may have oversimplified and undervalued by labeling it with just one noun name, like those Jews, those refugees, those Russians, or whatever. In this way, instead of feeding the flames of our anger or reinforcing our bitterness about past or present injustices, we can practice calling forth our compassion for the human condition that we all share. This is certainly no easy task, and it requires constant vigilance. But the potential rewards for ourselves, our loved ones, and our entire human family are magnificent. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your lecture, but my memory is short. Do you have anything published on this or books that you've written? I'd like to recapture what you said.
Thank you so much for asking that. I spent 5 years, from 2008 to 2012, trying to find an American publisher for the book that I wrote about my experiences in Germany, from which all these ideas about identity has come. I have not yet been successful. It was published in German, so if any of you want a very challenging experience, I can tell you how to order that book. However, I have a website, and my ideas about identity are not on that, but I have an essay about how I came to get involved in Germany, in German-Jewish dialogue, and some of you might be interested in that. So the easiest way, just Google Judith N, Levi, N for Naomi.com, and it'll come up. And then go to essays, and the essay that would be particularly informative is called Flowers in a Field of Ashes. So I think that's Flowers in a Field of Ashes, and then it's Judith N. Levi, L-E-V-I, not Y, like the blue jeans, not like the rye bread, .com. 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 That'll do it. And by the way, that video we just saw, as you could tell, was made by Danish TV. And if you want to share that with anybody, and I really hope you will, because in 3 minutes it says almost everything that I said in much longer, just Google YouTube, All That We Share, and it'll come up. Or All That We Share in Danish TV, it'll come up.
For you being a child of Holocaust survivors, when you go to Germany, how do you reconcile your personal feelings? Not as a professor, not as a, but as somebody who comes from a family that was victimized.
That's why I had to write a book, because the answer was so complicated. But if you read that essay, Flowers in a Field of Ashes, that really will give you some of the most important answers I could give you. I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors in the sense, some people think Holocaust survivors, or they use the term to refer to people who were in Europe during the Holocaust. My own parents actually came to America relatively early, not because of Hitler. They came in 27 and 29, but then they had to get their parents, their relatives, their aunts and uncles, their siblings out of Germany. And my father had a very large family, and they managed to get everybody but three perished in the Holocaust. So that question is since my talk today is about identity, let me focus on the identity angle here, that I thought the Jews were the good guys and the Germans were the bad guys, and that the Germans of today were contaminated by their history, although actually it was their country's history, and I couldn't see how anybody could be German and Jewish. And growing up, I never thought of my parents as German. I mean, they were born in Germany and grew up in Germany, but I never thought of them as German. They never spoke about our German heritage. God knows, I was going to say chas v'chalila, but that's from Hebrew. God forbid. So Germans and even German Americans were them, and German Jews were separate. And Hitler had certainly reinforced that distinction. So one of the first things I had to learn in confronting Germany, or even before I got there, I had to see that actually I'm very German. I'm not a German, because for me that means nationality, but I am very German. And I was raised by Germans. They were German Jews, but I was raised by Germans. So I got lots of German culture. I got lots of German child-rearing practices, which were very strict and demanding obedience and so forth. So in fact, I was connected to that country in ways that people who maybe came from Hungarian Jewish families or Russian Jewish families might not be. But I had to also do a moral inventory and ask myself, I'll just give one example, there's three in the essay. I realized that, I decided to go to Germany in December 1997. I didn't go until November, so I had a long time to think about what is my stance vis-a-vis the Germans. And I thought, well, if someone tried to hold me responsible for what my grandparents had done, I wouldn't take responsibility. But that's what I was doing to the Germans in holding today's Germans responsible for what their grandparents may or may not have done. So there was a moral inconsistency, and I had to recognize, well, then that's not, I can't accept that in myself. And I found two more ways in which I had been treating the Germans of today in a way that was not consistent with how I want to be treated or how I think anybody should be treated. So it was an ethical investigation, in effect. And that was just part of it. And just one more thing, when I went to Germany the first time, I realized how significant the German strand in my identity is, although there are many others. And I actually felt as if I had been walking around without an arm or a limb, and that limb had been returned to me because it is a part of who I am. And I had not acknowledged that. I had denied it or not seen it for many, many years. So and that's why I say who you identify with and who you consider as us versus them can affect your reconciliation readiness. And I had to work through all that in order to go to Germany the first time. And since then, I've been there 14 more times.
Your talk was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, Ed, I think everything that you said is absolutely gorgeous and helpful and beautiful. I'm wondering about the component of justice, because I feel like for me, like that is one barrier or like one thought that comes up in my mind as I am considering this idea of reconciliation, and especially if it's a situation that's current rather than in the past. It's hard for me to approach that idea of reconciliation and forgiveness when there's no justice or no apology from the person that did us harm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. One thought is, I prefer not to let others determine my state of mind and the state of my heart. So that if I'm carrying resentment and bitterness and victim identity, I'm the one that's harmed. The other person isn't. And so not just for self-protection, but in order to help me bring out the better parts of my identity, I need to clear my heart of that other stuff and not be dependent on what the legal system does or what the other guy does or anything outside of me, because that's not in my control. And I don't want to let the outside events determine who I am, what I do, how I feel, how I love. The other thing I would say is, let me remember it now. I'm sorry, I lost the other thing, but that's the place to begin.
Thank you. It's fascinating and very helpful. I would like to piggyback on the last question. I do understand and agree with you on that I have to be aware of my own situation and be true in my own heart. I also feel I have a responsibility to help our society in how to break down these barriers, and we're not going to get everybody in that room in Copenhagen or wherever. So how does one carry forth the concern to share the importance of our identity, both at whatever it may be, and our identity as part of society?
That's the challenge for everybody in this room, right? And as I said, if we want to do that, we each have to find our avenue, and they will be very different. It might just be teaching a Sunday school class. I shouldn't say just. It might be teaching a Sunday school class, or it might be giving a talk somewhere, or it might be contributing to a group that supports inclusiveness. God knows there are many, thank God, there are many, many channels for us to share our noble impulses and to promote them in the world. So I won't try to give one answer to that. Yeah, there isn't one, right?
Thank you for a wonderful talk and really timely and thought-provoking. I have a comment and then a question. My first comment was the most inclusive group is that we are all humans, as you said. There's another group on top of that as well. We're all members of this ecosystem, this planet, this natural system, and hopefully we can also include that in our identity. My question is along the lines of justice and what do we do? Do you have any, at beyond the individual level, is there any specific actions that we should take as a society in this country to heal the divisions? I really like the video. That could be one type of thing, some sort of YouTube campaign. But do you have any other ideas that would be particularly helpful right now?
Let me tie this in with the question that was asked earlier. It definitely is easier to reconcile when the other side has shown that they are worthy of reconciliation. Not every relationship. Reconciliation is basically repairing a relationship that has been harmed. And both sides have to participate. Makes it different from forgiveness, which you can do all by yourself. And you don't have to tell anybody that you've forgiven them either. But reconciliation is interpersonal. And the more that the other person has shown that they have repented, that they have atoned, the more they have taken steps to do some kind of restorative justice, for example, the easier it is for us to approach them, because we like to spend our time in the company of people who are decent human beings and are not perpetrators. So in the case of Germany, it turned out, what I learned was that Germany had done more than probably all the other countries put together that were involved in the Holocaust to face their past, and this comes back to you, to face their past, to educate their youngsters about it, to commemorate the victims, to make restitution to the victims, and to be unbelievably honest and to face their past with tremendous moral courage. Not many countries are ready to do that, or not many groups are ready to do that. And sometimes people have said to me, well, the Germans should do that because they were the ones most responsible and they committed the most atrocities. But in fact, in history, the worse the crimes are, the more the society typically tries to cover it up. So there's a book now, is it called The Forgiveness Instinct? Or is it Beyond, maybe it's called Beyond Revenge, The Forgiveness Instinct. If you email me, I can give you the reference. It's a very interesting discussion of these issues and how you have to feel safe in approaching the perpetrator or the other side. You have to feel, that's just one of the sort of the prerequisites. So I think being honest is the beginning. And I know when I was growing up, there are many things. I mean, the communists were the evil guys and we were the good guys. I grew up in the 40s and 50s. And now I believe that many subjects are addressed with somewhat more honesty in the school system, for example. But schools differ and schools are under local control. So, you know, they will vary a lot. Even in Germany, the amount and sophistication of Holocaust education, which is nationwide, varies from school to school because after the Nazis, the Americans made sure that the education system in Germany would be extensively decentralized. So there is no Ministry of Education in Germany. There are 16 states, and then there are, you know, all the little places. So honesty is one. Acknowledging the victims in various ways is another. Memorials is another. All across Germany, you see memorials of all different kinds. Sometimes a very small sculpture, sometimes a list of names, but with incredible creativity. And there are programs on TV all the time about the Holocaust. So that's just part of the answer. Yeah.
Somebody found the name of the book. It's Beyond Revenge, The Evolution of the Forgiveness Instinct.
I think it's Michael McCulloch.
Okay. It's on.
Yeah.
It's on
That's a very good book.
It's on the screen now.
And for those of you who are interested, there's a book written by a law professor named, I will get it, Martha Minow, Minow, in which she, and I think it's called Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, because after mass harm, a society at large they can pursue revenge or they can pursue forgiveness. And generally it's not either one, it's something in the middle. because revenge just feeds on itself. Oh, some societies definitely pursue revenge, but that can't last forever. And she examines the three major ways that societies have addressed injustice in the past. One is through truth and reconciliation commissions, like in South Africa. One is trials, like the Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust. And one is, what would the other one be? Trials, reconciliation. Probably reparations, but I'm not sure. There's a third one. And she looks at different societies and how they have done them and how that's worked out, the pros and cons and limitations of each approach. And the very first chapter is so compassionate. It's a marvelous read, even if you don't read the other chapters. Her first chapter about what happens to society and all the harm and pain that is inflicted and then perpetuated if it's not addressed. I recommend that also. Martha Minow, M-I-N-O-W. Yep.
It's a wonderful presentation. I was curious to know if you're being looked upon as a resource in our identity politics of this country. There's both the gender politics and the racial politics, especially, and conversations about reparations and, for slavery and other kinds of things. Is there anything that you've been involved in?
No. Nobody knows me. Hardly anybody knows me. And it's partly because my book is not out. I am now resuming my search for an American publisher. But, thank you. In Chicago, they don't know me, to say nothing of elsewhere. Thank you for the compliment implicit in that remark.
I want to also say your talk has been wonderful. I have a question about the word survivor. At one time, survivor meant people who almost died, from a crash or whatever, or war or whatever. And now it's become like there's a lot of different survivors now. Whether it's an abuse survivor or rape survivor, cancer survivor. Mm-hmm. And it seems like in many ways those groups have become identities rather than being an event that happened in the past that has its residue for sure, but I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. That's definitely true. That's a very strong identity group, and then there's solidarity among others who share that identity. And it reminds me of what I said, that it's very hard to let go of a familiar identity, and one may get rewards from that identity, a compassion or pity. Most people don't want pity, but they want compassion and understanding. And it may still be a very vital part of who they feel they are. It can be exploited, of course. And I think it can also become an identity cage. But I have not had cancer, so I can't put myself, for example, in that category. But I think it's exactly right what you said. It's now an identity, and the question is, which of our many identities will be the one that we wake up to every morning, or that we carry with us when we meet other people? When I was in Germany on a book tour, a woman asked a question. She was the daughter of a Nazi doctor. And she had always thought that he was taking care of people in hospitals, but then she found out that he had been a doctor assigned to the Einsatzgruppen, which were the groups of policemen who were drafted to slaughter Russian Jews and partisans in vast numbers. So she was asking me about how I think I had given a talk on reconciliation and forgiveness specifically, and she was asking for help in reconciling the two fathers that she knew. She loved her father, and she regarded him as her moral mentor before she found out about this other father. So she was asking me about this, and what just came out of my mouth. I said, your identity as the daughter of a perpetrator is only one piece of your identities. And I would encourage you to not to let it overwhelm all the other parts of you and the ones that make you feel happier. That's not to say she can't deny that part. And in fact, what she did with it, she is now traveling to France and Switzerland to participate in dialogue presentations to high school students and others, where basically she and a friend of mine from Hamburg, they team up with two descendants of victims of the Nazis, whose fathers were in the French resistance and they were murdered. And the four of them now, they call it Memory in Four Voices, and they give these presentations as a way of transforming their suffering into something that's beneficial for the generations to come. And they speak to high school students and others about what brought them together and why they've become friends. It's quite remarkable.
So that's the last question that we can address here. However, Judith will be available to speak with you during the coffee hour, and then at around 12:15 or 12:30, she's going to go into our library, and anyone who wants to join her there, we are going to continue the process of examining all of these identity issues that she has brought up. So thank you so much, Judith.